Hello, welcome along to Willis Resilience TV, a channel dedicated to bringing you coverage of a unique world record attempt to the South Pole. And we've got news. The race begins today, Colleen.
That's right. Very exciting. We're following teenage explorer Parker Liato as he begins his unsupported attempt to ski from coast to pole. You're looking at some of the latest images from the team. They've sent these overnight. This is the science portion of the program. But today, the ski race begins.
Yeah, so they're going to get their skis on. And you're a bit of a skier, I understand, Colleen.
That's right. I am a downhill skier, so I have the benefit of gravity. But I don't think Parker is going to have that. Not going to be so easy.
It's a little tougher for Parker and Doug. They'll be skiing 400 miles, aiming to average 18 miles per day. And it's not a beginner trail followed by a spot of après ski either, Colleen. This is seriously tough terrain in high winds and temperatures of 30 to 40 below zero.
All the while, they'll be pulling the equivalent of their own body weight in kit and supplies on an Arctic sled, also known as a pulk, something which you had a little lesson on yesterday, right, Dan?
It wasn't so much a lesson. They said, we want you to go and pull this pulk through a park. How do I do that? I said, we don't know. Just strap this thing to you and give it a go. And it was a lot tougher than I thought it was going to be. Very different, of course, pulling it over grass than it is over snow and ice. Yeah. But as you can see, I was struggling a little bit. You'll see more of that a bit later on. Yeah. Oh, they've got it tough over there.
A for effort. But no offense, Dan, Parker is a little bit younger, a little bit fitter,
no, plenty
and a little bit stronger, and from what we can tell, he's ready for the challenge.
I know that Parker can do this, and it's going to be a huge task for him. He's never done anything this long before or this hard. You know, this is going to be heavy sleds and a 25-day expedition, and he really has put his mindset to try to break a speed record, which is 24 days. So, you know, we got to have there's no room for mistakes, or you're going to really have to be on your game. And I think hopefully Parker learned that up on the North Pole, and about just how inhospitable this place can be.
So it's nice to have your company with us here in our purpose-built studio in the lobby of the Willis building in London.
This is actually the beating heart of the global insurance industry. Employees here and folks around the world have been captivated by the Resilience Expedition, and we're really shaking up Lime Street out there. We're broadcasting live footage of Antarctica out onto the street, generating
we
a lot
have those
of
big screens there. It's a little bit odd as you walk past, seeing and hearing yourself.
I've
it's
never
a
felt
new
so
one
tall.
for me. You've never felt so tall? Yeah, I know. You're not that short. I'm just a giant. It's the live satellite connection with Parker and the team that has sparked the most interest. We're hoping to catch up with the guys later in the show to see how they're getting on. They're now within touching distance from the start line of the race, an unsupported trek on skis from the coast over 400 miles to the South Pole.
Yes, and it is extremely tough out there, but as always, the team have the resilience to keep on going. And we want to hear from you. If you have any questions for Parker or the team, you can tweet us at Willis South Pole.
We've actually had tweets coming in already. We'll be putting your questions to Parker and the guys via satellite later on, hopefully. But now, here are some messages of support for Parker and the team.
Good luck, Parker! From Willis, Mumbai!
Hi, Parker. Warm wishes from Willis of Greater Kansas in the United States. Good luck, Parker!
Hey Parker, this is Paul from the Willis of Seattle office, wishing you good luck.
Just like our sales process, you're on the adventure. Win it for Willis!
cold in Antarctica, so think of hot stuff. A warm fire.
The beach, a hot chick.
Good luck, Parker!
Greetings from Willis, Peru.
Good luck on your expedition, Parker.
It's a warm, beautiful day here in Wichita, Kansas.
Wichita wishes you the best of luck on your expedition.
Go, Parker!
Oh, that was cute, wasn't
That
it?
was great.
A huge amount of support
Yeah.
for Parker, and I'm sure that will help him along his way towards the South Pole. They will be experiencing extreme weather conditions, and they are prepared for those, and so will be very resilient to them. But the question still remains, how resilient are we at home to extreme weather conditions? And this is quite pertinent right here in the UK at the moment. We are experiencing in certain parts of the country some of the worst storm surges we've had for 60 years. 2 people have been killed. Dozens have been injured. Some of the highest winds, Colleen, recorded in the Highlands of Scotland have reached 140 miles an hour. So this is a big story here in the UK at the moment, and I'm sure there's going to be quite a lot of damage as well that insurance companies are going to have to deal with. But of course, it's not just weather conditions in the UK that are making stories recently.
Yeah, that's right. That actually sounds like the deadly string of tornadoes that hit the Midwestern U.S. Just last month. So extreme conditions can happen anywhere, anytime.
And we'll continue exploring that link, that possible link to climate change as well throughout the time here on Willis Resilience TV.
Of course, the reality is that extreme weather can happen almost anywhere, which in part is what Parker and the team will have to confront when he steps outside of the comforts of the truck and into his skis for the race.
During the scientific crossing, we're all going to be in the vehicle, we're driving across the continent, and we're doing purely science. It's not unsupported, it's not a race, it's not man-hauling anything. Once we get to the start of the unsupported journey, the journey from the coast of Antarctica to the South Pole, the speed record, the setting of a new speed record attempt, basically, where Doug and I separate from the truck, and it becomes 2 separate teams, really. Me and Doug, completely unsupported, and the truck following us. We are going to be each hauling a sled that's going to weigh 180 pounds or so, 80 to 90 kilograms. And it's going to contain everything that we could possibly need to survive, which means there is no physical material transfer between me and the truck. There's no supplies being transferred. They're not carrying any of my food. They're not carrying any of my fuel. They're not carrying anything, not even communication equipment. I'm going to have my own satellite phone, our own GPS, our own communications equipment, so that if the truck were to vanish off of the face of Antarctica, it wouldn't matter. We wouldn't change anything about our strategy, we wouldn't change anything about our journey, it wouldn't put us in any dangerous situation, we would just not even look back and continue. So that means that we're carrying all the communications equipment that we need to survive, that we need to communicate with the people that need to hear from us every day, to know that we're safe, to know that, maybe if we need an evacuation, we have the ability to call for one. We are carrying fuel for every single day of the expedition. We are carrying food supplies for every single day. We're carrying all of the clothing that we could need, the spare clothing, all of that kind of stuff. We're carrying all the technical equipment, which is a little bit more intense for this expedition than it has been in the past, in the sense that we're going to need crampons and that kind of thing, just in case for the glacier and for potential, hopefully we won't need this, but for any potential encounter with crevasses, that kind of thing. Effectively, in the briefest terms possible, I guess, the truck is sort of a ghost in the background. It will not in any way, the truck will not communicate with us during the day. It will not give us anything. We will not give them anything. And it's there to tell the story of what an unsupported journey is like in Antarctica.
So the world record attempt for Parker is just about to get underway. We have pictures from Antarctica of Parker and the rest of the team getting themselves ready for the moment that he, alongside Doug, who is the polar guide, is the guy that's got the vast experience, is going to be making sure that Parker is heading in the right direction, not getting into too much bother. But in order for this to be a world record, it has to be an unsupported trek from the coast, which is where they are now. It's an ice shelf, so essentially it's the coast. A trek from there on skis to the South Pole. And if Parker completes it in 22 days, then he'll become the first man ever to ski to both the North Pole and the South Pole. So hopefully we will be able to chat to Parker and the guys just before they head off on that world record attempt. Exciting times, though. They're almost there. And joining us in the studio, we have a man who knows an awful lot about skiing and training for these rather extreme kind of races. Ian Ballantyne is a competitive cross-country ski racer, competed in the World Championships, I believe, in
2009.
2009.
That's correct.
It's kind of different because you spend a lot of your time going downhill, right?
Well, it's a very different discipline in the sense that we're training for races which are, you know, at the most 50 kilometers, 2 hours or less for those sort of races. But yeah, a lot of the elements are the same.
So what's your immediate emotion and feeling when you hear about people that are just about to embark on a 400-mile trek, averaging about 18 miles a day?
Yeah, it's crazy, really. It's very different to what we do. You know, I think dealing with the extremes of the low temperature would really be difficult for track cross-country skiers. But it's an epic sort of challenge.
Yeah.
So it's a very different discipline, but obviously significant training goes into both what you do and what this team did.
Yep.
How do you train for an endurance event like that?
You've got to be, I mean, it's strength and endurance. So you've got to be very, very strong, but you've got to have the specific technique, the strength and the endurance. So it's all sorts of training. We train a lot on roller skis whenever there's no snow. You know, this replicates the feeling of cross-country skiing on snow.
Okay, because Parker's from Yale in the States. Where's Yale exactly?
In Connecticut.
In Connecticut.
Yeah.
Doug, who's there alongside him, is from California. So they need the stuff that you've got down here, perhaps, to help them train and get in shape.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the really good ways of getting into shape for cross-country skiing, whatever the discipline is.
Yeah.
You know, these things only go forward. So Parker will have skins on his skis, so the ski will go forward whenever you know, whenever you push off. It's why the ski doesn't slip backwards. And
so if you're training on a road that is going on an upward incline, you won't roll back.
Because these things have ratchets, which mean they only slide forward. Yeah. But it gets the feeling of
and here's what
the balance, the technique.
Well, you froze there. That was an idea of what those things can actually do if you're going downhill a little bit.
There you are. So basically, you see they have ski boots, which are the same as on cross-country skis. The poles are just the same as you'd use on snow. The technique is essentially the same. This is downhill, but you can also, these guys will turn around and do the same thing back up that really steep hill with different techniques. So Parker on snow, he'll have lots of different terrain, gradients to deal with, you know, different types of snow. So you've got to be able to deal with all that sort of changing nature of the route, the course, the weather, the low temperatures. And that's the same doing track cross-country skiing on snow as well.
Yeah, and a lot of I think, if I understand correctly, when you're racing, you're kind of on a groomed trail,
Exactly,
or
yeah.
conditions that have been manicured to some extent.
Yeah.
What we've been watching with Parker, this terrain in Antarctica,
Yeah.
it is very rough conditions. There's the Sastrugi ice fields, and that makes for very tough navigating. Do you think, what's it like to try to go over rougher terrain?
It's just something you've got to train for. You know, you've got to prepare yourself for all different kinds of conditions. You know, it's the same with track skiing. You can have icy, really fast snow that will trip you up when you're not expecting it. You'll have, you know, very, very slow snow whenever it's, you know, a bit warmer. So you just got to train for all these different, the worst case scenario. You know, you just got to be resilient in terms of adapting to the conditions as you find them, you know, and it can be different every single day, and it can change from hour to hour. On track skis, we spend a lot of time getting the wax right, and then the conditions can change during the race, and the wax is completely wrong, and the guys who are leading the race can fall back, you know, way down the field.
To make an adjustment quickly.
And lest we not forget that Parker and Doug on this unsupported trek on skis are going to be dragging a thing called a pulk, which is a sled laden with kit and supplies that they need to keep them going for 22 days, including the tents and the camp material they need to sleep for 6 or 8 hours. Anyway, yesterday, have a look at this, Ian. You can make as much fun of me as you want. The lads thought it'd be a good idea for me to go out and feel what it was like to pull that kind of weight. What, about 80 to 85 kilograms worth, they reckon?
Yeah, try doing that in a freezer.
I think you got the best of you there.
Yeah. Nice try.
Yeah, it was right. But it was a lot harder pulling it across grass, especially in Bethnal Green in London, which is notorious for its really heavy grass.
Yeah, it's tough grass there. Yeah.
Whatever excuse you want.
Yeah. But it was a real eye opener actually. You should give it a go.
Yeah, no. Well, we actually train in Hyde Park for the skiing, and we see guys pulling pulks. It's a lot easier on the sand than on the grass. It feels more like on the snow.
Okay. Well, I'll try and do that next time. Ian, interesting stuff. Thanks so much for adding your expertise to this.
Well, we are getting excited here with the big push for Parker to start the race, but it sounds like it's taken its toll. We have some images from the very latest footage that was sent back from Antarctica overnight.
So, welcome to the pod. This is the tin can in which I've been traveling for the last I don't know how many days. It's been a while.
We're about ready to start. We're about ready to hit the pole, and we're gonna head down to the Leverett here in the next few days, and it's gonna be game time. And I think you know, he has to show his colors, and we have to get at it.
Hey, it's 10 p.m. You've just been brushing your teeth. We gonna stop soon and go to bed, or what?
No, we're gonna drive.
Why are we driving?
Now we can see where we're going, and it's good weather. We have our tracks in front of us, so
things are looking up.
Things are looking up, and we're gonna be traveling all night, I think.
We're doing this on the move. It's kind of bumpy in here because we're driving fast over Sastrugi. We're just trying to get to the South Pole today, and we're gonna try to move on towards the Leverett Glacier as well.
I know that Parker can do this, and it's going to be a huge task for him. He's never done anything this long before or this hard. You know, this is going to be heavy sleds and a 25-day expedition, and he really has put his mindset to try to break a speed record, which is 24 days. So, you know, we got to have there's no room for mistakes, or you're going to really have to be on your game, and I think hopefully Parker learned that up on the North Pole, and about just how inhospitable this place can be. You know, I'll do everything in my power to keep our team together, and hopefully we'll be standing at the pole.
I really don't know what's going to happen, but I'm looking forward to it.
Well, apart from the team, probably not too many people around that part of the world. In actual fact, Antarctica has a tiny population composed of almost entirely of scientists based at research stations, which can vary between 1,000 and 5,000 in the summer. Probably not that much of a social life.
No, I think it's pretty tough, and it's a very sparse population in Antarctica, but that's not the trend around the globe.
Yeah, London got about 8 million people, and that keeps on growing. And that is a decent link, I think, to what we're going to be talking now with our two guests in the studio. We're going to be discussing whether climate change will affect where populations live in the future. We have Aditya Bahadur from the Overseas Development Issue. Morning to you, Aditya, and Dr. Robert Verkerk from the Alliance for Natural Health. So we mentioned that London, Aditya, is growing in size, 8 million people plus, and we're seeing that, I guess, as far as the trend is concerned in most major cities. Where will people eventually have to live if we keep seeing extreme weather conditions that affect the way they live?
Yes, I think climate change-induced migration is a big trend across the world. In 2008, by some estimates, there were about 20 million refugees or migrants from climate change, and this figure might rise to almost 200 million by the year 2050. So we will see people moving away from areas that are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, be it along coasts or in low-lying areas, to areas that are not. We are seeing increasing urbanization across the world. More than half the world now lives in cities. Cities are also responsible for 80% of the world's gross domestic product, or 80% of the world's economic output. And therefore, it's critically important to also think about climate change in the context of cities. And this subject has traditionally not received that much attention.
Is there any doubt with you and your organization that climate change is having an effect on weather conditions and therefore on the way people are able to live?
Absolutely not. There's no doubt that climate change is affecting where people live and how people behave, how societies are structured, and climate change's impact on the economy.
So where will they live? Let's understand, where are these populations going to migrate to?
Yes, I think one of the big issues is that they have to move from coastal urban areas, and clearly urbanization has occurred around coastlines because of the importance of trade. And as we see shifts inland, we see some major geographic and geopolitical issues developing. And obviously one of the prime concerns is what kind of impacts is this going to have, not only on the health of those human populations, but also the health of the environment. And you know, we have such a delicate balance now that exists as far as greenhouse gas emissions are concerned. We still have a public debate as to how much the human-induced, the anthropogenic factors are in inducing that climate change. And from our point of view, it could accelerate the problems that we're already seeing.
Gents, we'll have to interrupt you in this chat just for a second, because we've got a very important race that's about to start in Antarctica. We'll come back to you and continue this debate about where populations might migrate to. But before that, the world record attempt, I believe, is just about to get underway. Parker and Doug are going to begin their unsupported trek to the South Pole, which is roughly 400 miles. Nathan Hambrook Skinner, I beg your pardon, who is Willis Communications Director, has got the phone by his ear. Nathan, hopefully you can hear us okay.
Hi,
I'd take that as a yes. How close are the guys to starting?
Yes, it's Nathan here. I'm standing on the start line with Parker and Doug, and we're ready to go. If you give us the signal, then I'll start the bus.
Oh, fantastic. Well, I'll tell you before that, just tell us how prepared they are. Has it been a rush to get to this point?
No, not at all. Massively prepared, yeah. We had plenty of time last night, and the skiers were putting their stuff together, and got up this morning, had some breakfast, and now they're raring to go. So we're just ready to go.
And confident that they can do this in 22 days?
Yeah, confidence is high. You know, it's going to be tricky. It's a long way to ski, but they know what they've got to do each day. And provided they can do that, then yeah.
Okay. Well, I tell you what, it's probably impossible to hear from Parker and Doug. So if you could just relay our best wishes to them, unless they are able to hold the phone.
Yeah, I'll do that. I'll relay the best wishes. Yeah. So you want us to start now?
Can you get Parker or Doug to acknowledge the camera?
Yeah, do you want to just give the camera a raise there?
There you go.
Okay, so...
right, there you go.
All
right, well, I tell you what then, Nathan. Should we get this party started?
Right, let's go. Best of luck, guys. Keep safe.
Good luck, guys.
And they're off.
Be safe.
Time has started. So that is the beginning of a unique world record attempt. Parker and Doug are on their way to the South Pole, which is the most inhospitable place on Earth. They have roughly 400 miles to travel, which is 640 kilometres. And in order for it to be a world record, they have to complete it in 22 days. So there they are, heading towards the South Pole on skis, dragging behind them those Pulse sleds that are carrying all their kit, their supplies, including the equipment and tents they need to make camp overnight to try and get as much sleep as they can before they then head off on the next day to try and trek 18 miles on average.
And it looks calm as we look at the video
Beautiful.
now, but we also heard it's negative 30. Is that what we
at
reported
least,
this morning?
At least it's minus 30 there as far as the temperature is concerned, and that is in calm conditions. So obviously if the weather draws in, it's going to become very heavy going. And just to remind you, if you aren't aware, it's summertime at the South Pole.
And
in
it's
Antarctica,
like 24 hours.
It is like that 24 hours, which is great for us because the truck icebreaker that is following the progress of these guys, and will do so hopefully all the way to the South Pole, will be beaming live pictures back to us, and we'll be able to keep bang up to date with the progress of those guys. But this is a really special moment. I'm so happy we had the satellite connection up and running.
Very
This is a thing. I don't know what you guys think of this, because this is the sort of thing that we've got really excited about over the last few days, but it's quite something, this, especially seeing as we can see it live.
I think it's extraordinary. It's demonstrating human endurance, and I think this concept of resilience that I know is the theme here is extraordinary, because the more we understand about human health, the more we realize actually it's not about being disease-free. It's about being resilient and being able to manage stress. And the more people understand that they have to be physically active, they have to eat a healthy diet, that's really what health's about.
And the other part of the expedition, Aditya, was a science leg. So they were conducting experiments, and hopefully that will give even more information with regards to climate change, because it is Antarctica and it's the barometer, isn't it? So that can only benefit scientists and research analysts like
And I was looking at some great best of luck messages to Parker while I was outside the studio. And I think it's through great attempts like this that school children and regular folk will learn about climate change, and climate change will end up becoming a part of the popular discourse. Quite easy for such an important issue to take a back seat, but I think great credit to Parker for really telling us all about it.
Thank you, great.
Robert, one thing I'm trying to understand, maybe you can help us articulate on, is what effect will climate change have on agriculture? How is this transitioning and impacting agriculture, and how will that play out with respect to the population with various geographies?
It is, of course, a double-edged sword. Not only does climate change have an impact on agriculture, but of course agriculture has a huge impact on climate change. And it's really trying to balance that equation that has been the subject of huge amounts of research. And of course, it doesn't matter what model you use to try and predict what may happen. What we've typically found is many of these models have assumptions built into them that turn out not to be correct. And one of the reasons for this is that the way in which human beings interact with the environment is a much more complex process than we often think. And we keep on finding, if you look at Malthus's original projections, we've been wrong. We heard others saying in the 1970s that by now we would all be dead, and there's been a repeated series of doomsday scenarios. So we see very grave problems as certain parts of the world, because of climate change, will actually get more rain, others will become more drought-stricken. And so we've got polar differences in how we handle these kind of changes.
Well, let's try a bit more specific on that. Where are the areas around the world that are most at risk, and why, Aditya?
On the whole, I think the poor are most at risk. So I would say least developed countries that have economies that are just starting to grow, as well as middle-income countries such as India, are where vast numbers of poor people live. Research done at the Overseas Development Institute shows that in 2030 there'll be 325 million poor people living in the 49 countries that are most at risk of climate change. So I think the poor are most impacted by climate change,
And those presumably living in coastal areas, as far as extreme weather conditions are concerned, or those that rely most heavily on their own produce.
Yes, and of course we also see the issue of desertification, more and more deserts, so arid areas that are already inland are going to expand in nature, and the bottom line is, how do we deal with those areas?
So it's not arable land, it's too hot and it's just impossible to
exactly, and we need energy. Energy becomes a vital issue in terms of trying to allow agriculture to function. So there's the energy equation cannot really be separated from the agriculture one as well as human health.
Okay. I just want to talk about where populations might go, but just to mark your card at the office or at home, wherever you're watching us here on Willis Resilience TV. Parker and Doug have started on their world record attempt. It's a ski trek from coast to pole, and we still have live satellite pictures. And it just, this really, for me, beggars belief. There is nothing in front of them apart from this white wasteland. It's just extraordinary live pictures we're getting from Antarctica. But we heard from Nathan, who is the communications director from Willis, that's with them on the trek, in the truck, Icebreaker it's called, which is going to be following them during their progress to bring these kind of pictures to us. He said that they are confident and they're positive that they can do this thing and get a world record in 22 days.
I think they had great spirits as they started on the finish line. I just want to remind people how heavy the gear is that they're carrying, and you know.
I know. Yeah, I tried dragging it on grass earlier and struggled with that. Yeah, about 82 kilograms, which I think is about 185 pounds. That's dragging their kit,
and so,
which for some people is their own body weight.
And within that kit contains everything they will need.
Yeah. And it's a
throughout the course of the race.
Because it has to be an unsupported trek. So they're not going to get any help from the truck, even though the truck is following them. There you go. But we'll keep checking in with those guys. So let's talk more about where these populations are going to go at each year, if indeed they do have to migrate somewhere. There's no space. Okay, well, Antarctica, there's loads of space. You can't live there, though, right?
I think in some countries, for example, low-lying Pacific island states, migrating to other countries like New Zealand is perhaps the only solution. And also, let's look at a country like the Maldives, where the highest point is only 2 meters above sea level. So there's very little that they can do to help populations adapt to climate change. Whereas other larger countries that are also facing climate impacts, such as India and Bangladesh, can help their populations move away from areas that are more vulnerable or exposed. Inland, for example, away from low-lying areas, not building in floodplains and other such sort of vulnerable and fragile areas.
And what about, when we're thinking about population growth, the time frame we're dealing with here? I mean, how much of a need is it going to be?
It's going to be a huge need. There's definitely a major problem in trying to deal with food supply to cater for a population of over 9 billion by 2050.
So 2050, that's a projection. There's going to be
we've got to deal with another
of 9 billion.
3 billion people.
Right.
And of course, the French government have been busy funding people to model how we could look at supplying food. And the fascinating thing is, if you look at food supply, even with existing agricultural systems in place, and with every individual eating 800 calories worth of meat, because there's an increasing demand for meat, and of course meat is very energy intensive, it also produces a lot of greenhouse emitting gases. So essentially that can be done. One of the issues is always how you distribute food to ensure everyone gets it.
We'll talk more in detail with you and another guest about GM crops later in the show.
Yes. What factors have to be considered so that geographies and cities and municipalities can plan to make a more resilient infrastructure? How can they go about taking steps to prepare for this trend that we're seeing?
I think there are a number of things that we can do. The role of insurance is particularly important and pertinent to the program today. And I think particularly insurance for poor people. What are the mechanisms that you help poor people to protect their own homes and workplaces? I think that's one. The other thing is that you engineer infrastructure in a particular way that is ready for the unexpected. So you build in redundant capacity where dams are built to specifically with the idea of absorbing shocks that may or may not occur in the future. One more thing I'd like to quickly add, I think increasingly there's an understanding of how the people who are actually going to benefit from infrastructural development should have a say in how this infrastructure should be designed.
There's a problem here. developed countries, countries with large GDPs, with countries with money to spend. Let's keep it very basic, in a better position, obviously, to become more resilient. Can you make the distinction between what happened maybe in the Philippines with Haiyan and what's something similar happening in a more developed country? Do you know what I mean? Like, so you do like how that would have affected, if there's, I don't know if there's another country in the world that you can liken to the Philippines that's more developed.
Absolutely. I think the links between poverty and vulnerability to climate change are now very well explored. Poverty leads to people becoming vulnerable to climate impacts such as typhoons. So less poor people are less vulnerable in a way. It's not as simple, but broadly that's the trend. But yes, wealthier countries, for example, let's take another example. The Netherlands has sea level rise, but they have a high GDP, high economic growth, also technical know-how. So therefore they're able to engineer towns and cities along coast so as to be resilient to sea level rise. Whereas a country like Bangladesh, which suffers from exactly the same climate change impact, does not have the wherewithal to really prepare for sea level rise. And I mean, we see with typhoons all the time, similar intensity typhoons hitting Philippines, or for example, the coasts of the United States, where the death tolls are vastly different.
And Richard, do you see a demand, do you see cooperation, collaboration globally to address this issue? Obviously, for example, when Sandy struck New York City, now there's a big push to build reinforcements and start addressing the problems of potential sea level rising that's going to impact their city. But when we have the Philippines and other less developed countries, those need attention too. So are there being steps taken to address this on a more
I think there's no doubt that an enormous amount of energy is being put into handling it. I think we've also been slow on the whole. Sorry to say that it does appear that we need a few disasters to occur for people to actually understand the predictions that were being made 20 years ago are going to start happening within our lifetimes. People always put it off, and now we're seeing, even in the UK, a small sum of some 30 million has gone into protecting the coast of East Anglia. We're still not sure whether it's going to do the trick in the next few days, but that's the kind of initiative that is already occurring.
I mean, that's right. Some 15,000 people have been advised to evacuate, and that's just on the east coast of the UK. But you've got experience of extreme weather and what can it do in New York, which is one of the most developed cities.
I was in New York in Battery Park when Hurricane Sandy hit, and literally the water rose 15 feet above the wall in Battery Park. And now they realize that rising sea tides are a serious issue, and now they're taking steps to try to determine how are we going to reinforce our city to protect against this, or do we need to make changes and go another tact?
And I think that the impacts will be seen in a few generations as well. People, once they hear about disasters, will see in the developed world a greater trend towards inland migration, because people want to ultimately live in places that are secure for themselves and their families.
Yeah, and so who needs to move? I mean, obviously there's a draw to live in a city, and there's a reason why people live in cities. So do you really think it's realistic that people are going to be moving out of these locations to adapt for potential?
Well, I think in areas where there is evidence that it's going to be impossible to have an infrastructure that resists, for example, the effects of rising sea levels, sometimes that will become inevitable. I think the difference in the developed world is that people can start to make a choice about it. And I think we'll see this difference in behavior that is really depends on how infrastructure versus choice can work.
Well, and hopefully we will make the right choices.
Exactly.
What happens if nothing is done? Where could this go? What's the worst case scenario, Aditya?
Sorry to insert doom and gloom into this lovely morning, but I think it's very serious. If we do nothing, it'll affect fundamentally the way in which we deal with other people. It'll affect the society. It'll affect our economy. It'll also affect the natural world, and it'll fundamentally affect the way life functions on Earth. So I think it's really time that we wake up and take this issue seriously, and firstly curb climate change and also help poor people adapt to it.
I don't see that as doom and gloom. I see that as a rallying cry. Let's do something about this. Gents, thanks very much indeed for coming. I apologise for interrupting our chat to see those
Hopefully you found that exciting.
Fascinating.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thanks so much. Obviously, growing populations in some geographies are putting huge pressure on the food supply, and some people believe the answer to this is genetically modified crops. We sent our reporter Nikki to find out more.
In 1798, British clergyman Thomas Malthus predicted that the world's population would reach its limit when we started running out of land to grow crops to feed the growing masses.
Well, his theory was that population is actually growing faster than food supply, and this means that once population reaches a certain threshold, there's just not going to be enough food left and people will starve.
This came to be known as a Malthusian catastrophe. We may not quite have reached this point, but 1 in 8 of us in the world is chronically malnourished, almost all of whom live in the developing world.
Well, the point of genetically modified crops is to engineer them to be hardier and more nutritious. This means that failed harvests will be less likely and yields will be increased. In fact, 1/12 of all arable land over the world is used for GM cultivation.
So, what do people think about it?
I think genetically modified food is potentially a really good way of solving some horrific famine crises we've got if, again, the science is sufficiently safe to make sure that we're not harming anybody or creating a monster nightmare scenario 30 years down the line.
What are your thoughts on genetically modified food?
Yeah, well, I'm very anti that sort of stuff.
Very anti it?
Yeah.
Why?
Just a kind of trust thing with food in general.
Arguments against GM crops tend to be based on environmental or public health issues. Also, the fact that once the GM crop has been developed, it becomes the intellectual property of the company, which is a very similar situation to the pharmaceutical industry, where a very few companies become extremely powerful and monopolise the industry. But we are in a world where families struggle to feed themselves and their children. So is it a case of just beggars can't be choosers?
We need to move towards small-scale agriculture that works with the land, that can produce very large quantities. You look at permaculture, for example. You can take a few acres of land and be incredibly productive.
Most scientists would promote the idea of making agriculture more efficient. Can be very beneficial. It's more beneficial in those places in the developing world where disease and drought is rife than in the developed world, for instance.
GM foods are the technology of large-scale industrial agriculture, and that's not what we need to feed the planet to maintain our soils, to maintain our land.
But you can also make plants to generate crops that will be more nutritious, and the most famous example of that is, for instance, golden rice, in which the rice has been manipulated to produce vitamin A, which is very deficient in ordinary rice. And because rice is a staple diet for a very large proportion of humanity, it means that a very large proportion of humanity are vitamin A deficient. And that leads to maybe 2 million deaths each year.
The problem with the golden rice technology illustrates the problem with lots of GM, that you're looking to, you have a problem of vitamin A deficiency. That's because people have inadequate diets. What you need to do is give people better diets involving fruit and vegetables and all of those kind of things. And that doesn't just deal with vitamin A deficiency, that deals with a whole lot of other health issues related to having a balanced diet. And if you just try and use a magic bullet solution, then you're actually leaving a whole lot of other problems in the wake that you're not dealing with.
Well, if we want to feed the world, the growing world of people, and 3 billion or so more people that's going to be in the world in the next 30 years or so, we have to increase the yield of crops on existing land. The only way we're going to do that sufficiently, I believe, is to embrace GM technology.
Well, it seems like GM crops can be used to help feed our growing and hungry population, but a lot more work does need to be done. So what are we waiting for?
What are you waiting for? Well, join us in the studio to discuss whether genetically modified food really is the answer to world hunger. We have Professor Jim Dunwell of Reading University's School of Agriculture, Policy and Development, and Dr. Robert Verkerk is back with us from the Alliance for Natural Medicine. Morning, welcome to you, Jim, and nice to have you back, Rob. Let's start with the basics here. I think there's a lot of people watching this, and me and Colleen included this morning, and really not too sure what genetically modified means. Is that a simple one to answer?
Okay. Simple terms, it means taking an existing variety of a plant, a crop, and rather than crossing it with another crop, and then selecting amongst the progeny, which is what traditional plant breeding is about, is to take that existing variety and add to it one or a small number of other genes, either from another plant or another organism, and then selecting for a plant that has the good characteristics it had before, plus the benefit of those one or two additional added genes. And that process is called genetic modification.
And sorry, what can you do that to? You were just talking about crops. Is it just crops that
you can do it
really,
really to any plant? And obviously, if looking forward, there are examples from animals as well. But so the first genetically modified fish, for example, is now under testing in the States, and that may be the first example of a genetically modified animal.
Right.
But my expertise is more in crops, and so you can really do this for any species.
So what's the benefit? What are we gaining, and what are the risks? Because this has been likened to the Frankenstein crops, and there's been all kinds of nervousness out there on part of the consumers. So what are the benefits and what are the risks?
Okay, the benefits, just going back a bit, we've now had about 30 years experience of this technique. It's 30 years this year since the first genetically modified plant was produced. So in that period of 30 years, we've been through experimentation, we've been through field trials and then commercialization. And the main benefits so far have been to farmers. It's given them improved practices where they can produce crops and produce products more efficiently, and those are by adding things like insect resistance genes. So rather than having to spray a crop to kill off the pests, they have a protein now within the crop that protects that crop directly. So there's no need to go to spray that plant. And so it's obviously more efficient for the farmer, and it's more environmentally beneficial as well.
So Rob, risk-free.
Well, of course, the reason that we're having this debate is that the science isn't clear in any way on this issue. And while we see in certain studies improvements of up to 33%, we also have seen overall drops in yield. We see some reduction in pesticides, but if you look overall, you see overall increased pesticides. One of the reasons for this, of course, is because one of the most common traits that's actually incorporated within crop plants is the resistance to Roundup herbicide, which is the #1 herbicide worldwide. So you create a crop that, on one hand, avoids having to weed, but you obviously need a lot of herbicide.
So what are the effects if we digest that?
Well, at the moment there's a big question mark over it. There has been a major study that was undertaken on rats that just last week was actually retracted, and there is a big debate about whether it was correct for the journal to retract that article. The bottom line is that there is a lot of theoretical evidence to suggest that the risks of transgene movement outside the crops into the environment at large could create effects that are multi-generational.
But no real evidence thus far?
Well, there are little pieces of evidence, but of course there's also been somewhat of a bias on the type of research that's been conducted.
Yeah, I think that's sort of slightly unfair in saying that you've described risks which you say are theoretical, and I think that's the sort of the definitive word, that farmers have been growing these crops in the environment for 20 years, and there's no kind of practical example that you can point to where there's been either a disbenefit to human health, animal health, or significantly to the environment. So
I'd contest that as well.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a case of a Danish pig farmer, for example, who decided to just stop using genetically modified feed on his pigs and moved to using conventionally produced feed, and noticed a very big difference
But he didn't make that change because of health issues.
Yes. Well, he was actually, what stimulated him was concerns that over time since feed, because we've got even in Europe now, 85% of the animal feed has become genetically modified. So while we have very little GM food going into the human food supply, right, there's an awful lot that's going into the animal feed system. So looking at animals is a very...
those reports are kind of circumstantial. Yes, you can make a change and you can see an effect, but as you know, that doesn't mean that the change made the effect. So, and I think that's what's at the back of a lot of the comments, that people imply that certain things happened beyond a certain date. When animal feed changed, then something else changed. Therefore, the change in animal feed caused the subsequent change. I think those aren't things which can be substantiated experimentally.
Now, look what I've done. I've picked this up. We have a genetically modified microphone. Because the microphone that we gave you earlier has died, I think. So I do apologise.
Thank you.
We're not asking you to do karaoke.
No.
But if you've got one that you're really good at,
please know.
We can find the backing track.
Yeah, I think on the science, and also bringing it back to the issue of climate change, one of the very interesting things about genetic modification is that, by and large, we're looking at genetic modification of staple crops. And back in 2002, a very big study was done that was funded by a number of United Nations organs, the World Bank, that pulled together 400 scientists from 60 countries to look at the issue of biotechnology in relation to climate change. And the ISTAT report, it's the abbreviation for it is Agriculture at a Crossroads, basically found that overall, and it's not just in terms of the risk to human health and the environment, but overall the change in agricultural practices that are associated with patented crops in which the agricultural resource, if you like, is limited to the hands of a few major corporations, is counterproductive to the kind of development of diverse agricultural systems that benefit smallholder farmers in the developing world. And of course, what we're seeing now with GM crops, about 10% of the land area is planted to GM crops, but of the 28 countries that are growing them, 20 of them are developing countries. So there's a tendency now for GM crops to be, if you like, dumped or pushed onto the developing world, persuading them this is what they need. And our view is, exactly as the ISTAT report has concluded after 5 years of research on this, is that to resolve these issues, what we really need is community-based systems of agriculture that become more self-sufficient. And the question is, they do this by using their traditional knowledge, using the natural base of the gene supply that's relevant to their areas, rather than something that's been produced in a lab over in the West.
I think it's a bit patronising to say that we're dumping things onto the developing world as though the developing world doesn't have a mind of its own. And I think that whole international dimension is really important.
And also, just quickly, on that point, let's bring in golden rice.
Yes.
And the fact that I guess that is being developed by developed nations, but could be so helpful to those that are living in poverty and underdevelopment.
Because I think it's part of the same issue that GM crops aren't just something, as was discussed earlier perhaps, that said this is part of some multinational, very intensive agriculture. It is also being applied to small-scale crops. And you mentioned rice and the vitamin A improvement there. That's a huge opportunity, and it's something that should be given the chance to work, and then we'll see whether it improves the health and the environment.
Yeah.
So farmers seem to want this. What about human consumption? Because I know you brought some samples of genetically modified food that humans actually eat, and that this has been around for...
Yeah, these are ones which used to be on the market in the UK, and the story as to why they're not is sort of too long, but you've got there in front of you a can of tomato puree that was the first genetically modified foodstuff available within Europe in the mid-90s. And here as well, there's an example that was sold by one of the retail chains, well-known retail chains in the UK.
So there was candy.
That was 10 years ago.
Genetically modified candy.
It contains genetically modified maize or corn flour, which came from the States and is used in lots of processed foods in the UK. And that's labelled, this is labelled, and those sold successfully. And then for a number of reasons, the retailers decided not to continue with that policy.
Do you eat genetically modified food?
Oh, I have done. I ate lots of cans of that on pizza spreads and
But
sauces.
one of the reasons why we're talking about this is because of the statistics that indicate massive growth in population. I think we're up to 9 billion for 2050. And GM, genetically modified foods, have been presented as one of the ways to address this and to alleviate this potential problem.
Yes, and I think that there have always been arguments that drought resistance increased nutrient availability from genetic modified crops may have a role to play. I think one of the big dangers is that if we see it as a panacea, and we've seen similar problems in healthcare where we've looked at initially at the glory of penicillin, and now we've seen that we have a chronic disease epidemic that needs a much more complex approach to dealing with it. And one of the great dangers I think that we face in relation to climate change and the changes in agriculture is that we dispose of systems of food production that have been evolved over many thousands of years with crop cultivars where the genome of those crops is rapidly being lost simply because of the move of industrialized agriculture. And we have to find ways of trying to preserve a biodiverse system as well as accepting new technology. And interestingly, most of the real developments that have increased yields, for example, or even have attributed improved drought resistance to crops have not involved genetic modification.
Would you accept that GM crops might be part of the solution?
I personally am deeply concerned about the risk of doing what nature cannot do and splicing in genes from unrelated organisms, and the impact that can have in terms of gene flow into the environment in terms of into non-cultivated species, but also the impact on animal health and human health. And I don't believe anyone who believes there is a clear answer on that basically isn't looking at all of the information.
But there are examples of scientists and doctors doing things for the good of mankind that nature can't do. For instance, women that, without the help of fertility treatment, wouldn't be able to have children.
Exactly.
Yes, and diabetics wouldn't be alive today if they didn't have human insulin produced in bacteria.
Exactly.
So science has a really important role to play.
The difference here is applying a technology to the staple of entire, areas of the world, whether it's maize in Africa or rice in Asia or wheat in Europe and North America. Those become the concerns, and I think there are big question marks as to whether the evidence suggests at this moment that any of the promises are consistently delivering.
But I think there are examples. I mean, GM is not incompatible with biodiversity. The idea that there's going to be some huge monoculture, it's only applied to these large-scale crops. I've been in West Africa and East Africa in the last 12 months and seen field trials of GM bananas in Uganda. That's being done by the local people, by the local government, with the support of the local farmers. And it's one of the examples is there are tests of nematode resistance. It's one of these tiny worms that lives in particularly tropical countries that eats the roots of bananas. And local subsistence farmers suffer hugely from that. So not to test an approach that offers a benefit to them, it doesn't affect the scale of their farming, but it means subsistence farmers can have material potentially in the future that is resistant to those worms in the soil. So those are things that are under test, and I don't think we should do anything to say implicitly that there's something dangerous in that technique.
Those efforts were happening locally, but what does the marketplace look like? What does the commerce part of it look like? And who's making this this chemical reaction, if you will?
Who's doing the work in the first place? I mean, in Africa, they have local labs now where the local government and the regional governments and the agricultural systems have the ability to, and the scientists there are good, and they're doing that genetic modification themselves. They have labs, they're then testing them in the field. If you're talking globally across the world, then clearly the focus and the big profits are in the big crops and the big companies.
Right.
But it's a way of making the two kind of systems compatible and saying there is a role for the private sector, yes, because that's changed the economy of North America substantially by industrializing farming, but there is also a role for these techniques at a smaller scale.
And therefore it's difficult not to politicise this in some way because the big boys will just get richer, won't they?
Well, I think this is the debate. While you're looking at small-scale GM occurring in Africa, that's a different picture to the fact that we now deal with a situation that the vast majority of the world's soya crop and maize crop has become genetically modified. And of course, it's that impact that we still really don't fully understand in terms of the consequences. There are about 65 documented cases of human health impact already for what's gone on. There's a lot of evidence in terms of potential for gene flow. Exactly how that's going to impact on evolutionary changes, we don't know.
As we found each day here on Willis Resilience TV, by doing these chats, having these chats and debates, there's an awful long way to go. But at least the debate is happening now. I just want the last point, and this is probably best answered by you first, Jim, is about how we engage the younger generations into this particular debate, GM crops, for instance, because it's what you guys know best about.
I think that's really key, and there are lots of initiatives that have gone on over many years of trying to introduce good science to school kids at an early age. And there are policies both in the US where there's a lot of bringing science into even primary schools, and the same things occur in the UK. It's easy. If we'd had a few more minutes, you could have extracted some DNA from a tomato fruit here in the lab. It takes 10 minutes. It's not a kind of magic thing that you have to be some mad boffin to be able to do. You simply mix up a piece of a fruit or veg with a salt solution, with detergent, mix in a bit of alcohol, and you have DNA in front of your eyes in a few minutes. When people see that, and children see that, they realise that it's not some kind of alien chemical. Yes. You know, we all eat miles of DNA in our fresh food every day. If you have salad for lunch, you'll have been eating yards and yards of DNA. It's a simple principle. And when people understand that, then they can engage in it.
And Rob, you could balance that with another kind of learning, but that idea of engaging the young is important.
Yes, and I would say to engage the young people, what they really have to understand is the sophistication of the natural environment. And I think we live in a society where many people become disengaged from understanding how intelligent, how resilient, if you like, the natural environment is. And one of the things that we have learned through history is that there are sometimes actions taken because of a given state of knowledge, often driven by the profit motive, that creates big untoward impacts down the line.
Fascinating conversation, gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us. Understanding our changing world, of course, is part of the reason and motivation for Parker's journey, and that's what we're talking about this week. So thanks for joining us to be part of that discussion.
Thank you.
So we've got the weekend off. I don't know about you guys. You got the weekend? Good. Yeah, just relax, chill out. But remember to keep checking in to see how Parker and Doug are getting on. In Monday's show, they got tough. They're not having a weekend off. Yeah, think of those guys in Antarctica. We'll check in with them on Monday, and hopefully they're making good progress along that route they're taking, and there isn't going to be too much inclement weather as they make their way towards the South Pole.
And also on Monday, we'll be asking energy industry experts.
That's tough.
Easy for you to say. Can we keep the lights on, keep energy bills down, and still meet green energy targets for 2050? Interesting discussion.
Yeah, every day's an interesting discussion. Every day's a school day here as well on Willis Resilience TV. We'll see you on Monday. Have a lovely weekend. And remember, keep checking into willisresilience.com to keep up to date with the progress for that world record attempt. See you later.
Thanks for joining us.